Diocese John Gatos passed away, so I ask you to keep him in prayer. They have not set the funeral arrangements yet, and I say that first for those who might want to go, and second, I'm sure it will affect the Mass schedule this week, and as soon as we find out, we will let you know. Last week, we finished the part of the Mass called the Liturgy of the Word. And this week, and for the next 5, we focus on the second part of the Mass that's called the Liturgy of the Eucharist. And before I get into it, there really needs to be a distinction. And that distinction comes in the types of sacrifices. Now, sacrifice is a part of the life that we are called to live, because sacrifice always flows from love. We make sacrifices for others out of our love for them. And the sacrifices of the Old Testament were meant in some way or another to express the love that God has for us and the love that we are called to have for Him. In the Old Testament, there are 3 types of sacrifices, mainly. The first was called the Thanksgiving sacrifice, also known as the tithe. It was the first fruits that one gave to God out of an act of thanksgiving, a recognition of God's love in our life and how it translates into the many gifts, graces, and such that we receive from Him. The Thanksgiving sacrifice, or the tithe, had a specific end in mind. Part of it was to go to those who serve God, namely the Levites and the priests. And there was a reason for that. Because the Levites and the priests were not allowed to have other jobs. They were not allowed to own land. They were not allowed to make money. So the recompense was part of the tithe, so that they could serve God and His people 24/7. And part of the tithe was to be given to the poor. There was always this understanding within Judaism that the obligations to help those in need were an act of love that reflected the thanksgiving that they themselves had for how God looked at them in their need and provided for them in their need. The second was the sin peace offering. And that was when someone had sinned, the best of their herd, the best of their flock was sacrificed in order to make amends for the sin that they had committed. And the third was the Eucharistic sacrifice. And it had elements of both of the thanksgiving and the peace offering. And it was meant to build the relationship that exists between God and man, with us as His sons and daughters by adoption. The best example of the Eucharistic sacrifice was the Passover. It was in that sacrifice that the people gave thanks to God for their freedom from slavery to Egypt, and for us from slavery to sin and death. And so all of those sacrifices were meant to draw us closer to God. In the gospel reading today, it is extremely sacrificial, telling us to renounce everything and to place God as the first priority, to take up our cross. Now, for our ears, that kind of loses a bit of the shock value that certainly the early Christians and the early Jews and the early Greeks would have had. They would have found that line quite offensive. In our own day and age, we use the cross as a symbol, as jewelry, as art. And even within the Catholic Church, the cross with the corpus, the crucifix. But we forget that the cross that Jesus calls us to carry was sacrificial because it is a method of execution. That's what the cross was designed to be, a method of execution. That in the way that we died to ourself and to our selfishness and to our sins, which is what the cross represents for us, that in offering that up, we join ourselves to the cross of Jesus Christ. So keep this all in mind as we begin the second half of the Mass, the liturgy of the Eucharist. What is the first thing that we do? We take up the collection. Why? If the collection is just about paying the bills, then wouldn't it just be wiser to split up the bills and say, okay, here's your bill for this month for the upkeep of the church? But that's not why we take up a collection. The collection isn't about paying bills. The collection is the thanksgiving offering, where the Eucharistic offering and the thanksgiving offering continue, and the sin peace offering does not, because that is fulfilled by Christ on the cross. That thanksgiving offering is taken up. The collection, I wish there were a better word for it because it sounds like a cash register. And that's not the purpose of it. It's the thanksgiving offering that is made to God as an acknowledgement of our own dependency upon His goodness and His will. And those offerings matter. Because in the Old Testament, when people brought the offering, it was judged, not by the priest, but by God. And if that sounds, well, Father, where are you getting that from? Remember the offering of Cain. It's rejected. We're not told directly why it's rejected and why Abel's is accepted, but to put in the context of the Old Testament, Abel gave the best. Cain gave the leftovers. And we take that because later on, as we get through the prophets, and the people of Israel are withholding the tithe, or they're giving lesser, God condemns them. He calls them thieves through the prophet Malachi for taking what belongs to God and harboring it for themselves. But it's more than just dollars and cents. It's the attitude that goes with it. For the tithe, the other part was given to the poor. Again, as a recognition of God's favor to us and the abundance that we have. And we see that that is also judged. The last judgment sequence from the Gospel of Matthew. How are people judged? I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink, and so on. Or I was hungry and you gave me no food. One of the reasons that when I got here I started the CARES Fund is to drive home the point of the responsibility each and every one of us has to look after the poor, to look after those in need. Because it's not an added extra if we do that. That's core to that Thanksgiving sacrifice. So we take that collection. And I am also obliged to give to that collection. But I have an added obligation because I'm responsible for what happens to it. We go back to the Old Testament. Ezekiel has some pretty harsh words for the shepherds who fed themselves and neglected their sheep. He was talking about the priest of the temple and about the king and their failures. They took the price from the tithe, but they didn't do the job. And so I'm very aware that not only am I judged on my own giving, but I'm also judged in what I do with what you give. And I take that responsibility very seriously. And we take that up, and then we bring it down with a couple other things. The bread and the wine. Unleavened bread specifically, and wine, not grape juice, wine. Why? Well, first, that offering is something that comes from us, given to God, out of love for God, to show our own understanding of that relationship that we have with God. And then once it's brought up here, it goes in different directions. The thanksgiving offering, because it's not part of the Eucharistic offering, is put off to the side. And that which is pertinent to the Eucharistic offering, the bread and the wine, is brought to the altar. And when it's brought to the altar, you'll see me say some prayers, usually silently. You'll see me lift up the paten, say a little prayer, put it down, pick up the chalice, do the same thing. What I'm doing at that juncture is what's called the Barakah Adonai prayers. Barakah Adonai is Hebrew for blessed are you, Lord. It's taken directly from the Passover meal. In the Passover meal, the father of the house takes the bread, thanks God for it. And from that time on, that bread is only to be used within the context of the Passover. He does the same thing with the wine, setting it apart specifically for that use. I mention that because the Eucharistic sacrifice is tied to the Passover meal. The Last Supper is the Passover meal. So it's sacrificial by nature. And instead of a spotless lamb, it is the Lamb of God that is sacrificed. And so once I say those prayers over the bread and the wine, that bread and wine are specifically for use for the Eucharistic sacrifice. Which is why, for example, that if there are any hosts left, I just don't take them and put them back into the container that has the unused host. It goes in the tabernacle because it is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. The wine or the blood has to be consumed because it has been set apart. So after I've done those prayers, you'll see me bow to the altar. And in that, I'm saying another prayer, a silent prayer always. And the gist of that silent prayer is asking for God to accept both me and this sacrifice of bread and wine, unleavened bread and wine, to be used in the context of this Eucharistic sacrifice. And then you'll see me wash my hands. Now, a lot of people think, and I've heard it said many times, that this is representative of when Pilate washed his hands before Christ was crucified. No. Remember back when we talked about the penitential rite, how there was this huge brass basin of water in the outer court that the priest or anyone who entered into the inner sanctuary of the tabernacle had to use before they went in, before the sacrifice was done. It was an outward show of something that was supposed to happen internally. It wasn't like God was saying, I don't want you to use dirty hands when you come to the altar. It was the representative of the cleanliness inside. And so I say another prayer, Lord, wash away my iniquities and cleanse me of my sins. Why? Because I'm about to join what we're doing to the sacrifice of the cross. And that is not to be taken lightly. Now, next 2 weeks, we'll go through the Eucharistic prayer and get more into this. But it's worth our reflecting about our own attitudes toward the sacrificial nature, not just of the Mass, but of Christianity altogether. Catholic worship is and always has been sacrificial by nature. And that sacrifice, again, flows from our love of God and spills out into our love of each other. The sacrifices by their nature are meant to to unite. And they're not done because we deserve it. For example, with the poor, so many times people will say, well, I pay taxes. Let that cover it. Or, those people have made bad decisions and poor mistakes. Probably so. Let them dig themselves out. I'll take care of me, you take care of you. Again, go to the last judgment sequence in the Gospel of Matthew. That the way that we show we are adopted sons and daughters of God our Father, brought into that familial covenant bond through our baptisms, is by mimicking His generosity and His love and His mercy. Why is it that Jesus says we must renounce everything and pick up our cross and follow Him? Because He wants the way that He loves to become the way that we love. And as far as evaluating how sacrificial one may or may not be, that's really up to you. I've been a pastor for 26 years, and I've never looked at a giving record once. Because your tithe is not to me. It's to God. I'm not God. So I don't look at giving records. Because it's not my business. It's not me you answer to. It's to the Lord. And second, what sacrificial offering might be is different to each person. You recall in the gospel, Jesus is sitting across from the treasury in the temple, and he sees these rich people just dumping money into the treasury, making a big deal of it. And then he sees this little widow drop 2 copper coins in. And he points out to his apostles, that lady. He says, she gave more than they did. Because she gave out of her necessity, not out of her excess. Last Friday, we celebrated the feast of St. Teresa of Calcutta, who the older people here might well remember. And she lived a completely sacrificial life and said, give till it hurts and then give more. And it's not because she was somehow sadistic and wanted us to suffer. But she understood the sacrificial nature and how it pointed to love. Because if we truly love, we'll sacrifice. I don't know of any healthy marriage where one of the spouses goes to the other and says, what is the least I can do and still say I love you? I can't imagine a spouse saying, oh good, that's how I want to reunite to you. No. A healthy relationship is, what is it I can do for you? What is the most I can do for you? Because that is representative of love. So entering into this second part of the Mass, into the Eucharistic sacrifice, having done first the Thanksgiving sacrifice, let us ask God to cleanse our hearts, to move our hearts, so that our sacrifice is actually a sacrifice. And that we follow what Jesus tells us today in the gospel, to pick up our cross, to renounce everything, and to follow Him.